Is this on now? Yeah? Okay. Well, first of all, thank you, David, for your words, which are a perfect introduction, I think, to the talk. So maybe I could leave out the introduction now. Und ich möchte auch Christian Mayer und Bernd Kortmann sehr herzlich danken für diese Einladung. Ik wilde het eerst in het Nederlands doen, maar ik dacht, then we might be hated even more, so I better not do that. Aber es freut mich wirklich sehr, hier zu sein heute und mit sehr vielen Leuten. Und ich danke auch allen Mitarbeitern für die exzellente Organisation dieser Tagung. Und ich möchte auch noch etwas anderes sagen. I would like to dedicate my talk to the memory of Richard Hogg, who was indeed one of the initiators of ISIL. And in fact, he was also an initiator for me because he was my very first teacher in my very first class in Amsterdam. And he gave me many opportunities. So in a way, I even doubt that I would have stood here had it not been for him. I also would like to say something about the Tower of Babel. I thought rebuilding it might be a rather hubris kind of thing. And so I thought it might be a good idea to build a tower with a very broad base and not too high and not too airy. And so in this tower I would like to make a plea for analogy, because I think analogy has a very broad base, because it's an important principle, not just in language, but in many other cognitive areas. And I would like to start with a more general introduction. There's one fundamental difference between functional and formal linguistic models with respect to what are considered important mechanisms or forces in language change. Whereas functional linguists emphasize that the language system is the result of adaptation to the pressure of language usage, formal linguists by and large ignore the circumstances under which language is used because they believe in a strong role being played by the presence of an innate or universal grammar. In my contribution today, I will plead for an approach to morphosyntactic change that makes greater and equal use of both formal and functional aspects. And I will argue that each linguistic sign, whether concrete or more abstract, has both a form and a meaning or function, and that the two indeed are indivisible. In addition, I wish to show that analogy, which is based on both form and meaning, plays a primary role in language acquisition and also in change. In my view, analogy is not restricted to analogical extension, a formal mechanism that is generally recognized as one of the factors working in grammaticalization. I will argue that analogy motivates language change, and that it is indeed more important because more basic than reanalysis. Now, the structure of my talk is on the handout. I shall first discuss the differences briefly between formal and functional approaches, emphasizing the need to look at both form and function together. And next I shall illustrate the important role of analogy as a general cognitive principle in both language acquisition and change, and also stress the fact that analogical thinking is evolutionary earlier, and that it is basic, also synchronically, to symbolic thinking. As to language change and evolution, I will then argue with Haspelmath 1999 that language is an adaptive system, but also, following studies such as Me Too 1991 and Kirby 1999, that more notice should be taken of the conventionalized formal system of language in which adaptations take place, and which, next to external factors, influences the course of development. And finally, I will indicate by means of a brief case study, indeed from my last book, that analogy may throw more light on the way in which languages evolve and are learned than has been admitted by linguists working on grammaticalization or within generative models. And this case study will be about pragmatic markers. Now, analogies can be very concrete or quite abstract. That is, an analogy may be based on both concrete lexical items as well as more abstract schemas. Important is also that analogy is a very fluid concept and therefore works quite differently from the type of global rules which are favored by generative or formal linguists. Hofstetter, 1995, gives a wonderful example of analogical thinking and the fluidity of it on a very concrete level of language use. This is under one on the handout. He describes analogy there as conceptual slippage and argues that this slippage is important in order to keep language workable and flexible. And it is to be preferred, he says, to a rigid system. So I'll read out the example, his own example. One last example from this genre, perhaps my favorite one. A grocery store checkout clerk asked me, "Plastic bag all right?" To which I replied, "Prefer a wood one, a paper one, please." Contributing towards this slip might have been the following factors. Paper is made of wood pulp. Grocery bags are brownish, somewhat like wood, and unlike standard paper, at least in the United States, not at all in where I come from. They are also considerably woodier in texture than ordinary paper is. And plastic and wood are both common materials out of which many household items are made, whereas paper is not. Substitution errors like this reveal aspects of the subterranean landscape, the hidden network of overlapping, blurred together concepts. They show us that under many circumstances we confuse one concept with another, and this helps give a picture of what's going on when we make an analogy between different situations. The same properties of our conceptual networks as are responsible for our proneness to these conceptual halo slips make us willing to tolerate or forgive a certain degree of conceptual mismatch between situations, depending on the context. We are congenitally constructed to do so. It's good for us, evolutionary speaking. My term, conceptual slippage, is in fact no more and no less than a shorthand for this notion of context-dependent tolerance of conceptual mismatch. Now, I will argue that this conceptual mismatch also takes place on a more abstract level, namely that of the system, once patterns have been formed. Analogical rules typically do not work across the board, but in local areas. And analogical learning starts with concrete situations and is based on experience, both linguistic and situational. Just like the kind of analogical reasoning that we saw in Hofstadter's example, which also depends on a situation and on previous experiences. In learning, the analogies may become more and more abstract by means of what Slobin has called bootstrapping. That means that abstract patterns deduced from concrete tokens begin to form a system, provided these tokens occur frequently enough. The most frequent concrete and abstract patterns then, that is, idiomatic phrases like the one under 2a on the handout, "she kicked a bucket," and grammatical rules like the sentence being rewritten as NP, VP, etc., they become then automatized and will become part of our lexical and grammatical knowledge of our system. In order to find out what the place of analogy could be in either functional or formal linguistic models, I found the schemas given by Dubois in 1985 very useful. In figure 1, Dubois describes a typical formal or innatist model which emphasizes that the only forces which organize language are forces internal to the system. In this picture, nothing penetrates the inner circle, which represents the system, from outside. While in a functional framework, it is assumed that all seemingly autonomous syntactic facts are actually the transparent results of the speaker's functional goals, so that no arbitrary syntactic apparatus needs to be postulated for language, as is indicated schematically in figure 2. To see language as an entirely self-contained system, as in figure 1, implies the arbitrariness of the linguistic sign. And this formal point of view is only possible if one severs the linguistic sign from its function, from its reference to the facts of the external world as interpreted by the speaker. Functional linguists, on the other hand, believe with Sapir that all grammars leak, or in a more extreme form of functionalism, represented by emergent grammar, that there are no fixed grammatical systems, that whatever grammar there is continually emerges out of discourse. Most functional linguists, however, do not deny the influence of some formal system of grammar, but only as one that is transmitted culturally and not genetically. Generally, however, they do not see a clear performance competence distinction. And this would leave some room, but I don't think enough, for the influence of the conventional or the arbitrary rules of language that develop in each individual speaker over time. It's to be expected from the differences between the two theoretical models that most formal and functional linguists also entertain very different views on the factors or forces that motivate language change. Functional linguists concentrate on semantic pragmatic forces, and due to their emphasis on language use and language processing, they see change as gradual, non-discrete, and guided mainly by external or contextual factors. This is especially true, I think, for linguists working within a grammaticalization framework. Here, the steering factors are essentially semantic pragmatic, with the formal changes seen as a mere result of these forces. For instance, in Kuteva 2001, she concentrates on what the speaker does in terms of functional and communicative needs, ignoring the overall linguistic system of the individual language user. And similarly, Hopper and Traugott in their grammaticalization book write, and this is under 3 on the handout, although it's possible to describe change in terms of the operation of successive strategies of reanalysis and analogy, the important question remains why these strategies come about. In other words, what enables the mechanisms we have outlined. So analogical extension and formal reanalysis are seen as mechanisms, as instruments, not as causes. What motivates language change are speaker-hearer interactions and communicative strategies. This is also a quote. In other words, the emphasis is on pragmatic inferencing, leading to semantic reanalysis, while a possible primary role played by form or the system is reduced or ignored. This is even more explicit in Hein et al. 1991, where grammaticalization is described as, and this is under 4 on the handout, the product of conceptual manipulation. It is a process metaphorical in nature and context-induced, in which cognitive restructuring precedes linguistic change. So in the functional model, performance is important, while for formal linguists, performance is a mere product of the language system. Hence, only the system, for them, is a worthwhile object of investigation. Since the 2 models represented in figures 1 and 2 are too much skewed either towards the functional or the formal end, we will need a different model to accommodate analogy. But before I turn to that, I will first provide a few more details about analogy. In analogy, both iconic and indexical forces are important, as is clear, for instance, from the example from Hofstetter, where he uses wood instead of paper, because paper is made of wood, which would be an indexical link, and because the bag looks in color and texture a bit like wood, which would be an iconic link. The strong interconnections between the indexical and the iconic are clearly indicated in Antilla's frame, what he's called the analogical grid, Antilla 2003, which, according to him, represents the woof and warp of cognition. It also implies a close bond between form and function, which applies to all meaningful units, from the smallest morphemes to complex words, but also to larger and more abstract syntactic structures. In this, I follow constructionist views. And because form and meaning form a whole, a meaning change may affect the form, but change may also be driven by formal requirements of the system. And I think this is very nicely illustrated in an old article by Coates from 1987, where he shows how folk etymological changes may be caused both by similarities in form as well as by similarities in meaning. Now, I don't want to use the same examples all the time, so I thought I'd use some examples from Dutch. Many Dutch people write the French loanword rotonde, they pronounce it as rontonde, because they see a similarity, both semantic and formal, to the adjective rond, which of course means round. And similarly, I've heard Dutch children use, instead of opereren, which again is a loanword, to operate upon, and they pronounce it as openreren, because somehow they see a link with the opening up of the body. I'll skip the next one, but the last one I thought was quite interesting, and this, you even see this mistake in official brochures of the Dutch government, so it's not just a folk etymological thing. Dutch speakers often use, instead of één gezinswoning, which means a one-family dwelling, they would say eensgezinswoning, because I think they mix up the word eensgezind, which means of one mind, and of course this word is in no way related semantically, so here it must be a formal link which makes them do that, although there may also be a phonetic reason. I also followed Deacon 1997 in the belief that the grammatical symbolic, that is the arbitrary system, which became part of human language in the course of evolution, was built up incrementally on the basis of these 2 primary modes of thinking, the iconic and the indexical, guided by general cognitive principles which also work in other non-linguistic domains. When writing about the emergence of symbolic reference, Deacon suggests that it's connected to the iconic and indexical reference in a hierarchy, which I've given under 6 on the handout. He writes, symbolic relationships are composed of indexical relationships between sets of indices, and indexical relationships are composed of iconic relationships between sets of icons. This suggests a kind of semiotic reductionism in which more complex forms of representation are analyzable to simpler forms. In fact, this is essentially what occurs as forms are interpreted. Higher order forms are decomposed into lower order forms. I'll try and explain what this hierarchy involves. First, iconic relationships. They are the most basic means by which things can be represented, and it's the base on which all other forms of representation are built. What is important here is that iconicity depends on recognition, and recognition, of course, depends on the interpreter. We interpret the world around us in terms of similarities and differences, and this is, of course, exactly what analogy entails. In our everyday experience, we only see differences which are somehow functional, which are important. So we learn to ignore non-functional differences, unless perhaps if we are autistic, we find that more difficult. In other words, we don't learn and remember more than is absolutely necessary. And this is indeed what Hawkins, 2004, has called the principle of minimized forms. He writes, and this is 7 on the handout, minimizations in unique form property pairings are accomplished by expanding the compatibility of certain forms with a wider range of properties. Ambiguity, vagueness, and zero specification are efficient, inasmuch as they reduce the total number of forms that are needed in a language. And he continues that this minimization is connected with the frequency of the form and or the processing ease of assigning a particular property to a reduced form. The ambiguity that may arise is no problem, he writes, since the multiple properties that are assignable to a given form can generally be reduced to a specific property in actual language use by exploiting context in various ways. For example, we learn to recognize phonemic and to ignore phonetic distinctions in the course of language acquisition because the latter are not functional. In other words, it's more economic to ignore those differences. Then next we come to indexical relationships. Iconic thinking is mere recognition, mere seeing, or indeed, and this is the point I want to stress, not seeing that there is a difference. Indexical thinking requires learning connections from past experiences, which are based upon iconic recognition. Physical contiguity or predictable co-occurrence are the basis for interpreting one thing as an index for another. But unlike in the case of icons, it's not based on similarities, but rather one thing recalls another thing through a causal connection. So, for instance, the well-known example, fire and smoke, are not iconically connected, because they don't look like each other, but indexically. And the connection can only be learned when fire and smoke have each been recognized as icons first. So that one next recognizes a fire, then when one recognizes a fire, smoke is also called up. And this is indeed how we learn words. We learn that with the object of fire, there is a word, fire, that goes with it. Icon and index are first recognized and learned in concrete time and space. A higher form of learning is to recognize patterns outside of this concrete context. And this then leads towards symbolic thinking, which is the next stage in Deacon's hierarchy. Symbolic thinking involves a shift from conditioned associations, icon and index, to symbolic associations by learning to recognize such abstract patterns. Quite clearly, frequency here plays a role too, because the more frequent a pattern, the more easily it is learned and ingrained. I'll try and make this hierarchical process more concrete by a simple example. This is 8 on the handout. When a child sees a banana, then it also, when it sees another banana, even though that banana may not be exactly the same, it sees that that is similar, and therefore it learns, after seeing a few bananas, it learns that there is something like a banana type. I must say, now that I read the word banana, I keep thinking of Mestri's talk, and I shouldn't have used apple, I should have used coconut and lychee, I suppose. And it's interesting that those three too, of course, form a set, just like apple and banana here form a set. Okay, what they also learn when they see a banana, that it is good food to eat when you're hungry. And this is the indexical relation, the function of banana, if you like. So when they then see an apple and they know that an apple is also good to eat, they begin to see an iconic relation even between apple and banana on a higher level. Not, of course, on the visual level, but on the functional level. They also begin to learn that there are other types of fruit, so they begin to learn there is a set of fruit, and that all these fruits are countable. So they learn something like count nouns on an even higher abstract level, and then of course they learn something about nouns on an even higher abstract level. At the same time, because they're confronted with conventional language, they learn about abstract indexical relations. So they learn that these words are often preceded in English by a determiner. So they learn something like determiner noun order, and so on and so forth. Now, in symbolic thinking, to recognize any pattern without it being concretely represented, symbolic thinking then is to recognize any pattern without it being concretely represented, to know what banana stands for without actually seeing one, to have knowledge of the pragmatic, semantic and formal relations between banana and other linguistic signs on different levels. This later symbolic stage is what Holyoake and Faggett 1995 have called system mapping, and they note it's only found in humans. For instance, they write that humans can see a similarity between a sample representing 2 trees and a sample representing 2 frogs, as in figure 3.1, even though the frog and the tree are not icons of one another. The iconic pattern that they in fact discern is the isomorphism of the combination of 2 of the same things. Humans then would not see an analogy between a sample representing 2 trees and another one presenting a frog and an apple, because here the higher order pattern, 2 of the same, does not apply. Now, non-human primates are not able to see the higher, more abstract analogy without extensive training, which crucially involved language training, according to Holyoake and Faggett. And they write that children begin to understand this mapping from the age of about 3 onwards, and would be able to solve the above analogy without help by about age 4. In other words, humans are able to perceive analogies between linguistic signs on a purely intralinguistic or symbolic level, as well as more concrete ones between signs. Hence, the form of signs can be motivated by other abstract forms. In this way, by learning more and more abstract patterns, a grammar system develops in children. And once it had developed in the course of human language evolution, it would be passed on as a convention by means of socio-cultural ties within a community. In other words, the conventionalized grammatical system behind each individual language helps in turn to form the next generation's internal grammar. But this grammar is learned or deduced by each child anew on the basis of the more general cognitive principles that humans possess, which help to form it in the first place. I then argue that the iconic and indexical modes of thinking, the so-called analogical grid, that played a role in language evolution, continue to play a primary role in both language acquisition and change. Now, how does this work in language change? On the basis of a frequency increase in particular tokens forming particular patterns, a shift on a higher, more abstract level may take place during the process of language acquisition and beyond, leading to further changes in token frequency and a speeding up of the change in question on the level of language use. To give an example, this is well-known example 9 on the handout. A token like I'm going to the market to buy some fish, as in 9.1a, occurs and occurred frequently without the indication of place, in the form I'm going to buy some fish, as in 9b. So that in certain contexts, this clause could as well refer to some future act, rather than some actual going. This possible interpretation depends on context, but the ultimate substitution of one pattern, a schematic pattern for another, that is of a V to V pattern being replaced by an AUX V pattern, was furthered by the system of English already formed, that is by the presence of many other periphrastic constructions and the fixed word order of finite verbs and infinitives. The existence of an AUX V pattern made a recognition of going to as auxiliary possible and even likely. In this way, a construction in one paradigm, namely the V to V paradigm, may come to be placed by the learner or the user under the other paradigm, the AUX V pattern. Now, I do not see this as a reanalysis on the part of the speaker. Rather, I see it as an analogical instance of not seeing a difference. The speaker attributes this going to pattern in 1b to the AUX V paradigm because to him it resembles that pattern in both form and meaning. And so it would involve realignment and not reanalysis. Such an analogical reordering is probably local at first, but when more subtypes of the going to clause pattern become affected, which together form part of a more abstract schema, the change in these subtypes may spread and become the norm due to its resemblance to other aux-vi patterns, like for instance will plus infinitive. For instance, this going to change, once realigned in some subtypes as aux-vi, spread from infinitives that could be collocated with concrete movement, as in 9.1 and 9.2, to infinitives which include mental activities, as in 9.3. And next also to subjects that were inanimate or empty rather than animate and agentive, as in 9.4. And 9.5 and 6 show that the old, the concrete going to, and the new auxiliary going to have now clearly become different types, each having their own characteristic features. So, for instance, 9.7 is not possible, and a combination of two verbs go, as in I'm going to go, is only possible if the first one is an auxiliary. This gradual reordering in the going to construction is then both steered indexically via the linking of to the auxiliary go, and also iconically via the fact that other clausal patterns of this type, namely the auxiliary verb patterns like I will go, also allow both an and inanimate subjects, and also allow both concrete and mental verbs. And the melting of to into going, so that we get gonna, is presumably on analogy of the auxiliary and the bare infinitive pattern, which is the infinitive, after all, most common after auxiliaries. In a frame like the above, analogy should then be seen as a cause rather than a mechanism. By means of analogy, we may arrange structures into other paradigmatic sets. And it's also analogy that causes the learner to build up more abstract types and schemas, and to keep the number of these patterns to a minimum. As I said, in this learning model, analogy is the primary force and not reanalysis. Reanalysis is, I think, what a linguist may see from the point of view of what changes in the system between generations. It's not something, I think, that speakers actually do. Speakers do not reanalyze an actual structure, but as I said, rather, they realign that structure to a different set. Now, analogy is usually seen as too loose and therefore impractical or unworkable as a principle within a linguistic model. But I believe that the looseness of analogy will be much constrained if one thinks of analogy as taking place on these different levels, and on a concrete as well as an abstract level. And in addition, the possibilities are also constrained by the fact that the patterns and the paradigms are organized both semantically and structurally, since each linguistic sign, be it single or complex, is because of its binary nature part of a formal as well as a semantic unit. An additional advantage of the analogical learning system proposed is that there is only one system to begin with, namely a lexical one. There are no separate systems for the lexicon and a syntactic rule module, as in generative linguistics, at least in the earlier forms. It's therefore more parsimonious from an evolutionary point of view, and it better fits language acquisition and also present neurological findings and the ideas developed about neural networks. And there's a similar advantage as far as language change is concerned, because the same mechanisms are now available for morphosyntactic and lexical change. And I think this links up nicely with the views expressed by grammaticalization theories, namely that grammaticalization and semantic change are intimately linked. If there are pathways of change to be found in grammaticalization, then one would expect similar ones to be found in semantic change. And this is indeed the theme of Traugott and Dasher's study on semantic change, namely that semantic change shows regularities and direction which in many ways are similar to grammaticalization. Okay, having mentioned the importance of analogy in language evolution and in language learning, I now want to consider its role in change and how analogy relates to the idea of language as an adaptive system, as advocated by Haspelmath 1999. It's important to stress, in connection with the changes that affected the English going to construction, that they are the result of two kinds of constraints: user constraints and grammatical constraints. User constraints are described by Haspelmath as constraints, I'm quoting, in terms of the language user's needs as being good for speakers and hearers in one way or another, as exhibiting user optimality, unquote. Haspelmath believes that behind most grammatical constraints, there are these user constraints which explain in more general terms why a change takes place. He considers the grammatical constraints, and that's important, I think, he considers those mere descriptions, theoretical constructs that help make the particular analysis work, but that would be the first candidates for elimination if this becomes possible. His model for change can be described as follows. To be explanatory, grammatical constraints need to be further analyzed in terms of constraints on language use. The latter are of a more general nature, having to do with motor cost and cognitive processing cost. Haspelmath further writes that language change starts in variation, and this is 10 on the handout, and that speakers tend to choose those variants that suit them best. These variants then become increasingly frequent and entrenched in speakers' minds, and at some point they may become obligatory parts of grammar. In this way, grammars come to be adapted to speakers' needs. Grammatical constraints are thus the way they are because they have arisen from user constraints in a diachronic process of adaptation. Haspelmath very much stresses the role of users' needs in change, and even though he mentions that grammatical constraints can largely be accounted for in terms of conventionalized constraints on language use, possible, purely formal constraints are not given the notice that they deserve, presumably because they do not offer the kind of functional or general explanation that he seeks. I think it's important to emphasize that a full explanation must consider the conventionalized grammatical constraints as well as the functional needs of users. And it's also important to realize that these grammatical constraints may have become completely arbitrary in the course of time, as for instance Kirby 1999 stresses. Historically, in terms of evolution, there may have been a close mapping between the user constraints and the as yet developing grammatical constraints. But in the course of time, the arbitrary or purely formal element in language must have become more and more influential on patterns of change. And it is for this reason that Kirby emphasizes in his comment on Haspelmath, and this is 11 on the handout, that the complete theory of diachronic adaptation needs to take into account both the selection pressures on linguistic variants that arise from E-language and the structure of I-language into which these variants must be coded. Where I would differ with Kirby is that in his proposal, the structure of I-language is necessarily universal and innate. The model of change that incorporates analogy best would then be as represented in figure 4. This figure shows the influence of language use, the outer circle, on the language system, the inner circle, as well as the influence from the inner circle on the way language gets used. I think it's now time to look at some nitty-gritty and at how analogy may be involved in the development of pragmatic markers in English. And I realize it's very difficult to prove that analogy is involved in syntactic change. I think it's easier in morphological change. Although I feel that Hendrik de Smet's PhD from 2008 is doing a very good job in this respect. I would invite anyone to have a look at this, everyone to have a look at this. Now, if analogy can be shown to be an important factor in the development of pragmatic markers, it would inevitably weaken the explanatory force of grammaticalization an sich. Now, we'll use here a case study by Tabor and Traugott, 1998, on the development of pragmatic markers, where pragmatic markers develop out of verbal adjuncts via sentence adverbs, which they see as a cline. I want to show two things. First of all, that there is no gradual unidirectional cline in this case, and secondly, that there is not necessarily scope increase, as they argue, which they see as a parameter, as something going against Lehmann's well-known parameter in grammaticalization, that there must be scope decrease. And my hypothesis is that a closer look at the formal changes involving verbal adjuncts from Old to Modern English will show that there is no question of a direct scope increase, rather that analogy has been at work here. And I propose that the verbal adjuncts, and I'm now referring you to figure 5, which is going to be quite important in the whole story, that the verbal adjunct, which is a stage 1 in figure 5, on its way to becoming a sentence adverbial, this is stage 3, developed via an intermediate stage, stage 2, in which it first appeared in a topic position at the front of the clause without a change in scope. When some of these sentence adverbials came to be used as a pragmatic marker at an even later stage, stage 4, they did so by filling a position that had already been created by other pragmatic markers, which themselves had often developed from reduced modal clauses that were used as separate or independent phrases in front of the main proposition, so not part of the main proposition. But they did have scope over the main proposition or the main clause. And this is indeed the second pathway that I've indicated in figure 5. In this development then, sketch in figure 5, there is no direct path of scope increase, since the interpretation of the adverbial as a separate clause intervenes in the process from verbal adjunct to sentence adverbial and pragmatic marker. And my suggestion is that the use of sentence adverbials as pragmatic markers in initial position took place by analogy rather than by an internal semantic pragmatic development of the adverbials themselves. And the analogy was possible due to semantic and structural properties that the sentence adverbials and pragmatic markers shared with these reduced modal clauses. In Tabel and Traugott's discussion of the formal development, stages 1 and 3 are shown, but stage 2 is not. And the difference between stages 3a and 3b, which I will discuss in a moment, is not taken into account. Stage 4, in which the scope of the pragmatic marker is more global, is reached only via gradual development from stage 3, in their view. The possibility that it is reached via a separate path, that of the reduced independent clause, which takes up a similar position and shares a similar epistemic quality, is not considered. By positing only 3 stages rather than 4, and by not taking into consideration the possibility of a separate clause or path, it indeed looks as if the VP adjuncts and their metamorphoses into sentence adverbials and pragmatic markers were always part of the same matrix clause, and hence that the grammaticalization and scope increase is a unidirectional and a strictly internally and contextually motivated development. I will first have a more detailed look at the development of sentence adverbials and pragmatic markers from verbal adjuncts. According to Traugott 1995, the climb from verbal adjunct to sentence adverbial to pragmatic or discourse marker is one of the staples of grammaticalization theory. Before turning to the details, we need, though, to pay a little more attention to the difference between two of the distinct categories on this climb, namely that between sentence adverbials and pragmatic markers. On the whole, it's not very difficult to distinguish the first stage on the climb from the other two. Verbal adjuncts, especially the ones that turn into sentence adverbials, which are mostly adjuncts of manner, behave differently in the sense that their scope is restricted to the VP. It's more difficult to see, however, how the development from sentence adverbial to pragmatic marker presents a climb, because the difference between the two categories themselves is not always so clear. When we turn to definitions of these two categories in linguistic dictionaries, for instance Crystal's dictionary, or specialized studies, we note that very often the same adverbs are classified as both sentence adverbials and pragmatic markers. For instance, they include both frankly and however, both surprisingly and nevertheless. This suggests that layering may be the rule in this case of grammaticalization, rather than just a temporary state of affairs in process. That is, the layering is more like a state of polysemy without much progress. Pragmatic markers are said to differ from sentence adverbials, and this is, I summarized that under 12 on the handout, in terms of scope and by their lack of referential content or conceptual semantics. Pragmatic markers also serve primarily to give cohesion to the discourse, to signal the speaker's stance towards what is being said, and to provide interpersonal bonding. Sentence adverbials, on the other hand, are said to have the immediate proposition or sentence as their scope and to be more fully referential. When we look more closely, however, at a fully referential adverb like surprisingly, which would presumably mark it as a sentence adverbial, we note that its scope may extend well beyond the sentence. I've got one example from the web, under 13. Hearing his words is bound to recall the beat poetry readings of the 50s. I asked him which writers have influenced him most. Surprisingly, he said, I'm incredibly ill-read. Now, it's clear that the surprise involves the narrator, who is not lexically present in the clause of which surprisingly is part, rather than the subject of the preposition he, and that the surprise in the narrator is indeed occasioned by the whole situation that is being talked about, namely a poet who doesn't read, and not just a sentence that it syntactically modifies. Surprisingly also expresses the attitude of the speaker here and could be said to achieve or call for bonding between speaker and addressee and provide cohesion to the text, which makes it more like a pragmatic marker. Consequently, it's not so easy to distinguish the last two categories on decline in terms of scope, cohesion, attitudinal aspects and bonding. Moreover, the amount of conceptual semantics carried by them seems to a great extent determined by the original meaning of the phrase in question, rather than by a process of generalization, which of course is a hallmark of grammaticalization. A pragmatic marker like anyway never had a very specific meaning, it was always general. Another very influential factor in this particular cline, is the position of the adverbial. Traugott and Dasher 2002 note, with many others, that the position of an adverb is correlated with difference in meaning. My suggestion will be that formal factors such as position and the syntactic nature of the source, namely whether it's an adverbial phrase or an independent reduced clause, as well as its original semantic content, are crucial in the development from verbal adjunct to pragmatic marker, rather than the process of grammaticalization itself, which could perhaps be better seen as a byproduct. In many cases, the change of a VP adjunct into a sentence adverbial or pragmatic marker can be related to ellipsis, rather than to a slow, gradual, inferential process. And this is especially true in those cases where the earliest instantiations with the source concept are exclusively clausal or phrasal. I will now show this with the help of a study of adverbials, an old one by Swan 1988, where she distinguishes 4 classes of sentence adverbials, as you can see under 14 on the handout. And she observes that in Old English, most of the potential sentential adverbs, with the exception of some truth intensifiers, notably sooflicher, meaning truly, and witotlicher, meaning certainly, and some subject-oriented adverbials, notably richtlicher and unrichtlicher, meaning justly and unjustly, are still close to or interpretable as manner adjuncts. What gets used instead as sentence adverbials in Old English, and this is a very important point I wish to make, are clauses such as I've given under 15 on the handout. So something like that is saarlich thette, or wes eek wunderlich that, etc. Even more interesting are a number of occurrences with richtlicher, which I've given under 16 on the handout, where richtlicher is preceded by and followed by zwa, so, or by tha, then. And this clearly indicates its nature as a reduced clause, with and initiating the clause and zwa and tha referring back to an earlier clause. These examples are under 16. These clausal epistemic phrases usually appear in front position in Old English, while the adverbials by themselves mostly do not, except the ones that are already most like sentence adverbials. Table 1 then shows which of the potential sentence adverbials in the Old English corpus, which Swan looked at, occur in front position. It's clear that front position is regular only in column 1, the column of the truth intensifiers. This front position is furthermore linked to a specific word order. It is notable that the usual word order after initial adverbials that are clearly identified as sentence adverbials on semantic pragmatic ground, which, as I said, are only found among the truth intensifiers in column 1, that the word order is subject-verb or ex-verb, that is, typically with the verb second position, which is typical of a main clause. Of the 43 initial instances with witotlicher in table 1, column 1, Swan notes that 33 have subject-verb order and only 8 have verb-subject order. But in all those 8 verb-subject examples, it is another topicalized element that occasions the inversion, as you can see in one example in 17. So you have sooflicher and then another topic element, and it's the other topic element that causes the inversion. So quite clearly, the adverbial in front position is still seen as being outside the clause, because you can't have 2 topic positions at the beginning. So sooflicher here must be seen as a separate clause. Similarly, sooflicher takes subject-verb except in 5 cases, in which again another topicalized element causes the inversion. And this indicates that the sentence adverbial should be interpreted as strictly separate from the matrix clause because it has no influence on the order of its elements. If the adverbial was part of the clause, the regular order would be verb-subject after the adverbial, due, as I said, to the verb-second nature of Old English, and this is what we find with the fronted adverbials in columns 2 and 3 in the table. The use of subject-verb order in verb-second languages like Old English, and we will see in a moment this is even more strictly true for modern verb-second languages like Dutch and German, is thus a very good indication that the truth intensifier is a separate phrase. In other words, it is at stage 3b or 4 in figure 5, while verb-subject order indicates that the adverbial is still part of the matrix clause. In other words, it would be at stage 2 or 3a in figure 5. The evidence that word order is linked to the status of the adverbial is strengthened by semantic pragmatic evidence. A sentence adverbial interpretation is strongest for the very adverbs that take SV order. Swan established clear semantic pragmatic grounds for sentence adverbial status, mainly among the modal adverbs, again the first column in table 1. And among the few pre-post evaluatives in column 2, there are no unambiguous examples of either SV, subject-verb, or verb-subject order. However, all 9 pre-post adverbs can be interpreted as manner adjuncts on semantic grounds. In other words, they would still be at stage 2. And as to the pre-post adverbials in column 3, for all instances with Richtlinie and Unrichtlinie, word order is again ambiguous, but the interpretation as a manner adverb is again possible. And of the rest group in this column, most instances are ambiguous as to word order except 3. Now, 2 of these are clearly topicalized manner adjuncts followed by verb subject. These are examples 18a and b on the handout, which is indeed what we would expect on the basis of my hypothesis. The third one, 80c, looks like a sentence adverbial because here we do have SV word order. Semantically, both an interpretation as manner adjunct or as a sentence adverbial is still possible, as I've tried to indicate in the translation of 18c. But the word order perhaps makes clear that the interpretation already is as a pragmatic marker. So in 18c, you can translate Sweden medom liedje both as it was fitting that, but also that he guided it in a fitting manner. The situation in Old English thus looks fairly straightforward. Adverbials which function fully as sentence adverbials do not show unambiguous evidence of VS order, which strongly suggests that these adverbials constitute separate phrases. In this respect, they resemble the fuller clauses that are also used instead of these adverbials, as I've illustrated in 15 and 16. And this suggests in turn that there is no direct development from VP adverb to IP adverb and to an adverb beyond IP level. Such a shift only occurs when the original adverbial comes to be used as a separate phrase, which enables it to acquire scope over the main proposition when it's placed above that proposition in a higher reduced clause. Now, the Old English distinction by means of word order has disappeared in modern English due to the fixing of SVO word order and, of course, the loss of verb second, but it's still visible in the modern Germanic languages that have preserved verb second. And I will show by means of some examples from Dutch that the semantic distinction still exists between adverbials followed by SV order and adverbials followed by VS order. And a distinction among the same lines exists in modern German and also in the modern Scandinavian languages, although there are small differences in usage between the individual adverbial cognates. 19 then gives some examples of adverbials that only allow VS order. The sentence adverbials here all derive from verbal adjuncts. I'm not going to read all those, but I think in the first example, like waarschijnlijk heeft zij het allemaal opgedronken, it shows that these adverbials are used as sentence adverbials and that they have not progressed beyond stage 3a in figure 5. That is, their most extensive scope is the IP. That they should still be considered an integral part of the clause is clear from the fact that multiple topics cannot occur here, as the ungrammaticality of 19c shows. So you can't have waarschijnlijk and then followed by another topic, which means that waarschijnlijk must be outside the clause. 20 then gives examples of sentence adverbials or pragmatic markers where only SV order is found. My last mark, of course, it should show that waarschijnlijk is inside the clause, not outside the clause, because you can't have a double topic there. 20 gives examples of sentence adverbials where only SV order is found. And the sentence adverbials here, like eerlijk, frankly, kortom, in short, jammer, sadly, they can most easily be linked to reduced clauses etymologically. An origin as a manner adverb or intensifier is difficult here from a semantic, pragmatic and or formal point of view. In modern Dutch, however, the same form eerlijk can also be used as a manner adverb. That's the only difference. The other two, kortom and jammer, cannot. And then it means in a frank or honest way. As such, it may appear in first or topic position when emphasized. But then, and that is important, it's always followed by VS order and not by SV order, as the example in 21 shows. So there you have eerlijk heb ik instead of eerlijk ik heb. So honestly I have. So honestly have I instead of honestly I have. The question arises why cases of sentence adverbials originating in VP adjuncts with clear SV order did not yet occur with any frequency in Old English. Now what may have happened is the following. VP adjuncts could appear in initial position in Old English when they were topicalized, as examples 18a and b have shown. it's possible that through this topicalization, some of the adverbials, provided they had the right attitudinal or epistemic quality, that is, it could happen with adverbs expressing judgment like shamelessly, justly, truly, but not with purely descriptive adverbs like slowly, they could begin to change their scope because of their frequent position at the beginning of the clause, in terms of what Bollinger 1952 has called linear modification. This principle of linear modification claims that the pre-post element will tend to modify everything that follows it, due to the fact that we happen to process language utterances in linear fashion. Once this had happened, the same adverbial phrase could also begin to occur separate from the clause, that is, with SV order, because it now expressed the attitude of the speaker. The different word order would now also be necessary to disambiguate between the manner reading and the sentence adverbial reading. And this stage seems to have been reached in the modern Germanic languages where both VS and SV order are possible with the same type of adverbs. This development, if correct, entails two things. The scope of the original VP adjunct changed presumably through its change in position and not through pragmatic inferencing of the adverbial itself. And further scope increase was presumably helped by the fact that other initial but reduced clause adverbials with SV order already had wide scope. So I would say, on analogy of these reduced adverbials, which they resembled in both form and function, the original manner adjuncts could become sentential adverbs too. For English, this latter factor would have worked even stronger upon the loss of verb second. When verb second was lost in the course of the Middle English period, all adverbials would be followed by SV of whatever origin, that is, whether they originally were part of a higher clause or not. And thus their falling together under one category strengthened this pattern, and at the same time weakened the differences that we have observed for Dutch. And secondly, the category itself came to be further isolated as a category separate from other adverbials, namely VP adjuncts, in that in English this position, as an unmarked position, became virtually exclusive to sentence adverbials or connectives. Upon the loss of verb second and the fixing of SVO word order, the appearance of other arguments in this initial position became rare in English, whereas it remained a regular unmarked topic position for adverbials and indeed for other types of arguments in the other Germanic languages with V2, as long as they functioned cohesively, as I think Bette Loulos has shown very clearly in her talk. The function of these adverbials as a connective device helps explain why they were frequent in initial position, and thus why this position could influence the change in scope. From these historical and comparative details, it becomes clear that the wide-scope sentence adverbial pragmatic marker must originally have been placed outside the main clause in the form of a prepositional phrase, a reduced clause, or a predicative clause followed by a that complement. These clauses function as sentence adverbials and have scope over the following clause. And when reduced to an adverbial, they would resemble other adverbials but retain their scope over the next clause, which now they become part of. In other words, there's no scope increase or decrease, but scope stability. In turn, these adverbials could help other adverbials to gain a similar position and a similar function by analogy. And I was going to add a few concluding remarks, but in a way this is already a conclusion and I can see it's about time, so I think I should stop here. Thank you.